agony while waiting for answers. Jamal Khashoggi's fiancée renews her fight for justice a year after her partner was brutally murdered by his own government. I'm Imran Garda, and our newsmaker today is Hatice Cengiz. This month marks a year since journalist Jamal Khashoggi walked into the Saudi consulate here in Istanbul and never came out. He was trying to get documents so he could marry his Turkish fiancée. Questions remain over who ordered his assassination. It's clear it came from someone within the Saudi state, but who? Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman blames rogue elements. The CIA blames him, and so does Hatice Cengiz. Earlier this week, I sat down with her on the sidelines of the TRT World Forum and asked if there'll ever be justice for the man she'd hoped to marry. And Hatice Cengiz joins us now on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. Once again, here at the Forum, you have to open up fresh wounds, raw wounds, and talk about Jamal and what happened to Jamal. Does it become more and more difficult to keep on reliving the trauma of what happened?
Bu üzerinden bir zaman geçtikten sonra artık
Well, actually, after a while,
yani özellikle benim için
especially for
zamanlardaki
me,
gibi çok büyük bir
it's
duygusal travma hikayesinden daha çok
it's more than just an emotional trauma. It's become a fight story right now. That's how I want to see it. And it's about what I experienced so far, and I try to focus on what's going to happen from now on, because right now, here, we're not talking about my personal relationship with him, my love story with him, because I'm talking about an exemplary personality. He is an exemplary journalist, and he has shown an exemplary attitude. And actually, we are talking about raising awareness for his story. And it was not a choice of my own to be in this position, but actually I have been involved in this despite my personal choices, and I will be continuing to remind people of the values that Jamal believed in, and I believe that I have taken it to a different level from the first time I experienced this.
1 year on, 1 year from first asking for justice, what does it tell you about the world and power that there are still so few answers about his murder?
Evet, biliyorsunuz bu forumun açılış konuşmasında
As you know, the President gave a speech at the opening of this forum, and he touched upon this very precise question: how the rest of the world showed a reflex, especially the Western world did not show a reaction to the violent murder of Jamal Khashoggi. He pointed that out, and I actually share the same stance with the President. I am in agreement with him, because we've been talking about the same thing for nearly a year. The perpetrators of the crime are not brought to justice, and there are court proceedings in Saudi Arabia, but there is nothing that's shared with the public. We have no documents about the court proceedings in Saudi Arabia. There is no detail. We don't know what's going to happen from now on, but the entire world knows that the king is naked, but everybody's looking into each other's faces, but nobody is willing to talk about it. Some people think of it in terms of bilateral relations, some people think of it in terms of economic interests or other trade issues like in oil business, but people have supported the covering up of this murder, and yes, for a year we have been talking about the same thing about this perpetrators of this murder, but nothing will be the same again in the world about his murder.
Jamal's son Salah came out and said that other people on the outside are exploiting his death, exploiting the anniversary of his death for their own political purposes, and that he fully trusts the Saudi government. Now, I understand he lives in Saudi Arabia right now. Do you believe that he is completely sincere in what he's saying?
Actually, I don't really want to talk about these matters, but Just to give you a very brief comment. Considering the social and political status he's living in, I don't know under what kind of circumstances he's been living in after this event. I don't really know. We believe that we are going through this in a warm room, but we don't really know under what kind of psychological pressure he is giving these statements, because I don't think that that's a rational perspective. Because what kind of country manipulated this in terms of political incentive, in terms of political interest? What country was that, or what happened after that? There is not even a certain result about this murder. Yes, the Saudi Arabian image on an international arena has been hampered, but that was Saudi Arabia themselves that were responsible. This is all I can say actually about that.
If Mohammed bin Salman was sitting here where I'm sitting now, what would you say to him?
I wouldn't prefer that, actually. I wouldn't prefer to be in that position, because nothing that he will say to me, nothing that he will explain to me would satisfy me. I wouldn't be willing to be in that position. Think of it this way. You are losing one of your most loved ones in the world. Would you be willing to be in the same place with the person that will be responsible of that murder? I wouldn't really be willing to be in that position of talking with him.
Their story changed over the months. Initially it was, we don't know what happened, he left, to maybe something bad happened, to maybe there was a fight, to eventually accepting that he was killed, even though there is still a defensiveness and possibly covering up of certain elements of the story. Do you, when you look at it in that way, do you feel that you will never get the true full story from the Saudi state because of how they've behaved over the past year?
Evet, bu da ihtimallerden bir tanesi.
That is one of the options, yes. That is a very high likelihood. But I believe that justice will be served sooner or later. And Allah has His own understanding of justice, history, and time as well. People that perpetrated this crime will not get away with it. And considering what has happened so far, the entire world knows and sees how a very big mistake was made. Thousands of journalists are being killed. Hundreds of journalists were killed in 2018, but not even one of them perhaps made it to the news. Many of those murders were not covered in the media, but this violent crime really touched the conscience of people. Jamal Khashoggi's death brought a lot of people under the common denominator of conscience. And right now, the picture that we see gives us a lot of answers. Yes, I know that Jamal Khashoggi will not come back ever. Yes, Saudi Arabia might talk about the truth behind the story, but I don't really live with that dream. It might take time for certain truths to reveal themselves, but there are certain things that never reveal themselves. But it's really very difficult to even foresee what might happen. Saudi Arabia is going through great levels of upheaval. The Crown Prince is making efforts to be the king of the country, but there are also a series of reforms that are being adopted in the country. So it's really not difficult, not easy to see how the Jamal Khashoggi event will unfold. But I believe that people who gave the orders for this murder and the perpetrators will not get away with this crime. Mm-hmm. This is what I believe in.
You followed Jamal Khashoggi's writing before you met him. You followed his tweets. You were inspired by his work. His opinion and his work was possibly so controversial that some people felt they needed to kill him for it. To those around the world who don't know what Jamal stood for or don't know what his philosophy and ideas were, what would you say he stood for, and why were his ideas so dangerous?
Yani aslında Cemal insanların
Jamal
bilmediği başka dünyadan getirmiş bir takım düşünceleri bu
had
dünyadaki insanlara
opinions
anlatışan bir insan değildi. Hepimizin bildiği.
that were actually quite common to all of us, but actually he wanted to adopt and also defend values that were not very popular in his region, democracy taking the lead. For example, as you know, our Arabian Peninsula is made up of kingdoms that are ruled by monarchies. So Jamal was born in this geography and served as journalist in this region. And since 2010, there has been certain levels of transformation in this Middle Eastern region. And he thought that despite the fact that there are monarchies reigning over this region, reforms need to be implemented. So he thought that the wind that sweeps the reforms in the region should be also adopted in Saudi Arabia. Considering, for example, how Saudi Arabia wanted to stop the Arab Spring wave after 2012 and how after the coup in Egypt, Turkey and Saudi Arabian relations soured, when you consider all of these events, we can put it this way. If there is now a democracy fight in the Middle Eastern region, that started in 2010, and Jamal was a speedy defender, advocate of those values. He was not a revolutionary, he was a reformist. Quote-unquote, revolution is a very wide concept. In his own country, he wanted to explain the values of how reforms will bring to the countries. He had a very strong pen. He had very different ideas because he had the capacity to analyze his country really well. And the best thing he could do was to continue writing. That's why he left his country to settle in the US and to write better. He actually wanted to be an objective journalist, an honest journalist, and he wanted to express truth under any circumstance. That was his effort, and that was the example that he set.
Very finally, as you continue to fight for justice for Jamal, what would you like his legacy to be?
Well, actually, this is what I think. Especially in the last 4 or 5 months, there has been a great wave of change in the Arab regions, Algeria, Sudan, and then Egypt and in Lebanon. I believe that as though Jamal is whispering to people's ears from afar, carry on with your just fight. Yes, I am not able to see those, but I am feeling them. It's as though he's saying that, because when I read such news, I believe that if he were here, he would welcome those developments. I say to myself, he would have very interesting comments on what's happening, and he would start talking about his memories in Lebanon, especially with the latest developments in Lebanon. That's what I thought. It's as though I might be bonding with these things emotionally because I had an emotional relationship with him. But his message to the Arab world would be this: people in this region should not entrust their own rights to other forces. That would be his message. Another thing that I would like to emphasize about Jamal, that I respected a lot, actually, this was the reason why I respected him even before I met him. He left everything behind in the Saudi Arabia and resettled in the US. That decision was what really made me respect him, because we sometimes are challenged a lot when we make decisions in our daily lives, because, we have our loved ones, we have our jobs, we have our houses, if we're married, we have kids. He had all of those.
bırakmak zorunda kaldı.
Jamal had to
O da
leave all of
isterse
that behind in Saudi
kendi
Arabia.
ülkesindeki o reforma inanmayan insanların tarafına geçip
He could have
hayatının
sided
bundan
with
sonraki
people who
kısmını
did not
reform
believe in
olarak yaşamaya
reforms,
devam
and he could
edebilirdi.
have lived in
Ama
welfare
kendisine,
in
özellikle kalemini
in his country for the rest of his life.
Right.
But he did not allow others to
Dolayısıyla
break
Cemal'in
his
bence
pan.
uğruna bedelini ödediği hayatı
He
en büyük
paid
mesajı.
the price for his job, and that is the biggest message.
Hatice Cengiz, it's been a pleasure talking to you on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much. In his almost 10 years as South Africa's president, Jacob Zuma faced numerous corruption allegations. While in office, he escaped justice. But now he faces 16 charges of fraud, racketeering, and money laundering, and could spend 25 years behind bars. Earlier, I spoke to South Africa's former ambassador to the United States, Ebrahim Rasool, and asked him just how damaging the Zuma years were for both the ruling ANC party and South African democracy. I began by asking him if the years of corruption allegations were now finally catching up with the former president.
I think everything has caught up with him. His last throw of the dice has not worked. The courts have said, no matter how old the case, no matter how contaminated you allege the things were, you're going to face your day in court. And for South Africans, I think they can now start to believe that the new dawn is taking shape. And so we're hoping that opening this door of prosecuting him will now lead to the things that are alleged in the Zondo Commission to now be followed up and prosecuted. And if you add to that the fact that the state has now decided to procure lawyers from the private sector to prosecute cases because we don't want contaminated structures and people within the existing system to do damage to the cases, I think we have reason to feel some optimism at this stage.
When you mentioned the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into state capture, this idea that the state was subservient to business interests, the Gupta family, that other hands were controlling, business interests were controlling the state and politicians were corrupt. There was a feeling throughout that one of the reasons why Zuma is untouchable is because he's got receipts. He's got dirt on too many people. Too many people are liable to lose a lot of money and their reputations. That's why nobody really wants to touch him. Is that still a reality?
I think Zuma had his show at the Zondo Commission and it was all bluster. This one is a spy, that one is an apartheid spy, this one is that. And so he had the opportunity to put up, and he could not put up a credible case except a web of conspiracy theory that he put. I think that emboldens us. If you then look at the systematic work that is being done, for example, the United States imposed sanctions on the Gupta family. If you're looking at the negotiation of extradition treaties with the United Arab Emirates as we speak, I think that noose is beginning to tighten, and hopefully this will have a receding sense of impunity on a permanent basis. Because that's what it was. It was a culture of impunity that came with Zuma and the ability to threaten everyone. And maybe it's blanks that he is shooting at this point.
So tell me if I'm wrong in mentioning any of this, that for at least a decade, under President Zuma, the government was corrupt.
That's uncontested.
It was captured.
That's uncontested.
They stole a lot of money.
That's uncontested. The president put it at 1 trillion rands the other day.
You were an ambassador at that time, representing the country. Surely you must have known this was going on.
I would say that one of the reasons that I was asked to resign as premier by the Zuma ANC at that point was because we had led the Western Cape to vote against him at the Polokwane conference. And when he came back, he wanted his own people in power. And so I gladly stood down. And I think that that was part.
But I mean, what was becoming US ambassador your sort of exile to Siberia, even though it's a prestigious position?
No, it's a prestigious position, but it was also a reaction to the plummeting fortunes of the Western Cape. From a polling of 53% at the beginning of 2008 to a defeat of 32% in the 2009 elections meant that they had to show that we dealt with him, but we are not finished with his constituency.
Do you have any regrets that you didn't say the emperor has no clothes during those years?
I think we said it with 70% of the Western Cape votes going against Zuma at that point. And I think that we should have belled the cat. But sometimes some things need a gestation period, because at that point, even people who now speak up loudly against him were enablers. I'm happy not to have been in the category of the enablers, but the enablers were so many and so numerous that the country was not ready to hear this until the first penny dropped.
Okay, so there might not be enablers right now, but they are quiet, silent defenders or people who are lying low and still within government. The Zuma faction. How much sway does he still have, or do they still have, especially when it comes to state security agency, the intelligence community, and so on?
I think the best description we can give of both the ANC and the country is that both of them are in transition. There's a coexistence of the new that wants a new dawn and a break with the past, and the old who are fighting for survival. And the old wants to be sure that they stay out of jail, that their resources are not seized, that they are not disabled from a further role in the country. And so we are having this coexistence of two contending forces, and the battle at this moment is to make the good people win out. And some of them on the other side are not as silent as you think, that they're actively organizing. I think that they're strengthening or trying to strengthen their hold on Luthuli House, the headquarters of the ANC. I think that if the president doesn't populate Luthuli House with good people, it could be the point at which the counter-dawn is gestated.
Unemployment at 29%. You don't need to be reminded of this. We saw horrendous xenophobic attacks against other African nationals, symptomatic that things are not going well, and something that we saw under Zuma as well. Cyril Ramaphosa has had 18 months or so to get things in order. Why should South Africans believe that he's one of the good guys?
Look, I think that Cyril wields a scalpel far more skillfully than a machete, or as we call it in South Africa, a panga. That is his preferred way of operating. He did it in the Kempton Park negotiations in the early 1990s towards a South African democratic dispensation. So I think people have a sense of his trust. I think more and more people are beginning to see that it is not as easy to get to dislodge the Zuma corrupt cabal, that you've got to set up the task. I mean, I think that the new director of public prosecutions admits that she's got very little below her simply because we've now had to hire legal expertise from outside the state to act as prosecutors. So I think the one thing that's going for South Africa is the trust factor in Cyril Ramaphosa. That is really one of the great things that I think we do have. On the other hand, I think we are also hoping that at the beginning of next month, that the South African Investment Conference will be a major success in kickstarting our economy again, that Moody's does not downgrade us even further to junk status.
But it's a tough job. How do you actually tell investors or convince them that you need to pour money into this country when it's got all these deep problems?
Because I think that our first job is to maintain the investors that we do have, that pulling out is more expensive than staying in. And that, for example, the mining sector have seen that there was that horrendous mining charter that we have now begun to reverse. I think we're doing the same things on intellectual property. How do we revisit some of those matters? I think the Tito Mboweni budget speech on the 31st of October will be absolutely crucial to show whether we have grasped the nettle of how do you make more sustainable state-owned corporations like Eskom, like Transnet, and so forth. I actually do think that once people see that the president and his finance minister are able to stand up to populists, then I think it becomes easier for us to show our credentials to the investment community.
By populists, you mean the EFF?
I think there's a populism that has one foot firmly in the ANC, from whence the EFF comes, and one foot firmly outside of the ANC, where the EFF is now. There's a continuity there. And that, I think, needs to be understood, that the EFF are being exposed every day, but we need to beat back the populists within the ANC in order for us to get coherent economic policy as a convincing case to not only South Africans that the future is looking better, to Moody's to prevent the downgrade, and to the investment community to say we are open for honest business.
Right. So you were involved in the struggle against apartheid. You were a comrade and ally of Nelson Mandela. A lot of people struggled to bring democracy to South Africa. But you speak about grasping the nettle. 25 years on, it seems as if the ANC is still talking about grasping the nettle, right? Isn't this an excuse in a way, a good story to the South African people? Yes, we won liberation. Yes, we overcame something that was pathologically terrible. But a quarter of a century on, the fact that South Africa is in the state that it's in now, hasn't the ANC, the only thing the ANC has going for it right now is that it's blackmailed emotionally the South African voter each time they go to the polls by saying, hey, you can't disown your mother and your father, vote for us. What has the ANC really done for the country in 25 years?
Look, I think that one can go through a lot of theories, but let me give you one simple fact. The Gini coefficient that measures the gap between rich and poor in a country, when it is purely based on the economy, what the private sector does, it goes to almost 0.7, which is quite high because 1 is the highest. When you add in what we call the social wage, the free healthcare, the education, the pensions, and all of those things, that Gini coefficient goes closer to 0.6. Now, that's the difference between building a safety net for the poor. On the other hand, I think that you're right. We don't want an unemployment figure of 30%. We don't want a growth rate of just about 1% and all of those kind of things. But it's also in the unique nature of the transition of South Africa that I think that we needed to grab the political state as the springboard or the beachhead to the economic state that we wanted. There was a massive aberration about 10, 12 years ago that derailed us from the next sequence of the transformation, and that hijacked black economic empowerment for family empowerment, whether it is a Zuma family or a Gupta family, for nefarious procurement processes and for capture. I think that this is something that we had not budgeted for, if I can put it like that, because I can tell you, 10 years ago, Eskom had a AAA rating. In its credit worthiness. It is now just, Fitch has just put it at negative at this point. That's what's happened in 10 years.
And people still experiencing power cuts in the cities, yeah.
I think it's less, but the fact that we're not out of the woods on any of these state-owned corporations, and I wouldn't want to soothsay our way through all of those things. It's a dire situation.
Ebrahim Rasool, a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
What's making an impact online? What has people sharing and discussing and debating all the stories from around the web?
Newsfeed, every day on TRT World.